My mother kicked me out of the family cabin at 9:47 on a Friday night. She had walked into the small upstairs bedroom where I had been folding the sweater I had been planning to sleep in. She had been holding her own small coffee mug. She had been wearing her reading glasses. She had said, in the same casual voice she had been using on me for 34 years when she had been about to deliver something cruel, "Nessa, we have been thinking. You should probably go home tonight. The will reading is tomorrow morning. You will not need to be there." I had set the sweater down on the small bed. I had looked at her. I had asked her what she had meant. She had said, "Your father and I have decided that the cabin should stay in the family. We have been talking. Your brother has been the one who has spent every summer here. Your brother is the one who is going to need it. We do not want any confusion at the reading tomorrow. The cleanest way is for you not to be there. You can come for dinner next Sunday at our house. We can talk about it then. We are sorry. It is the right thing for the family." I had been quiet for a long moment. I had then asked her if my father knew she had been telling me this. She had said yes. She had said it had been their decision together. I had told her I would leave. I had picked up my small overnight bag from the floor of the bedroom. I had carried it down the small wooden staircase. I had put on my coat in the small entryway. I had walked out the front door. I had driven the 4 hours back to my apartment in Hartford. What my mother had not known on the Friday night she had asked me to leave was that the will reading the next morning was going to be irrelevant to the question of who owned the cabin. The cabin, by the time my mother had been standing in the doorway of the upstairs bedroom, had been jointly owned for 15 years by me and my grandfather, who had transferred half the property to me as a small recorded gift in 2009 through a quitclaim deed that had been filed with the county. My grandfather had died 9 days before the Friday night. The recorded transfer from 2009 had survived him. My mother and father had not known about it. They had been operating, on the night they had kicked me out, on the assumption that my grandfather had owned the cabin in full. The assumption had been incorrect. I want to tell you what happened the following Tuesday afternoon, when my mother had finally called me, and what I had said to her, and what I had been offering her by the end of the conversation. I want to tell you because there are people listening to this who have been quietly preparing for years for the moment when their parents would finally do something that would make it impossible to keep pretending the parents had been the kind of parents the family had been performing they were. I want to tell you what I had been quietly preparing. Before I do, hit subscribe and tell me one thing in the comments. Tell me about a moment when your parents asked you not to come to something that should have been yours to attend. Tell me what they said when they asked. Tell me whether you went anyway or whether you let them have it. I read every comment. Now let me back up to my grandfather Branko, because the rest of the story does not work without him. My name is Nessa Polikoff. I am 34 years old. I am a civil engineer at a small infrastructure consulting firm in Hartford, Connecticut. I have been doing this work for the previous 11 years. My job involves the small, careful design of culverts, retaining walls, and small drainage systems for rural and semi-rural properties throughout New England. The work has been useful for what I am about to tell you. The work has taught me, more than anything else, that the most important details of a property are almost always the ones nobody has been looking at. The drainage, the setback, the recorded easements, the small quiet documents at the county registry that establish who actually owns what. The visible parts of a property are what everybody argues about. The invisible parts are what determine the outcome. My grandfather Branko had been born in 1932 in a small village in eastern Slovakia. He had emigrated to the United States in 1957, when he had been 25, with my grandmother Eulalia. The two of them had settled in a small mill town central Massachusetts, where my grandfather had worked as a machinist for a small tool company for 41 years. My grandmother had worked as a seamstress at a small bridal shop. The two of them had saved carefully for decades. In 1968, when they had been in their late 30s, they had purchased a small piece of property on a lake in southern New Hampshire. The property had been 17 acres. The acres had included a small one-room cabin that had been built by the previous owner in 1952. The total purchase price in 1968 had been $4,700. My grandparents had spent the next 40 years improving the property. They'd expanded the cabin into a small 3-bedroom house. They had built a small dock. They had cleared a small section of the woods for a vegetable garden. They had been the kind of immigrant homeowners who had treated the property as their actual life's work, separate from and more important than the small mill town they had been living in during the year. The cabin had been the place they had been most themselves. My grandmother had died in 2007. My grandfather had been 75 at the time. He had been alone for the next 16 years until his own death 9 days before my mother had kicked me out of the cabin. He had spent those 16 years mostly at the cabin, in the small, careful way some widowed men spend the last years of their lives at the place they had been happiest with the wife they had lost. I want to tell you about my relationship with my grandfather, because the relationship is the foundation of everything that happened. I had been close to my grandfather since I had been small. My older brother Merrick and I had spent our summers at the cabin from the time I had been about 6. Merrick had not particularly enjoyed it. Merrick had been the kind of child who had preferred the small organized activities of summer camps and youth sports leagues. I had been the kind of child who had preferred the small unstructured days at the cabin, where my grandfather had been letting me wander the woods with him, had been teaching me to identify trees, had been showing me how to read the small contour lines on the topographic maps he had kept in the small wooden filing cabinet in the back room. I had been, by the time I had been about 10, the grandchild who had been spending real time at the cabin every summer. Merrick had stopped coming around 14. He had moved on to other interests. My parents had visited the cabin occasionally. My mother had been my grandfather's only daughter. My mother had grown up at the cabin during the summers of her own childhood. My mother had also, by the time she had been an adult, decided that the cabin had been a small inconvenience that her parents had been holding onto for sentimental reasons. My mother had been polite about it during my grandparents' lifetimes. My mother had been planning. My grandfather had explained to me once, in the small, careful way he had been telling me things, to sell the cabin as soon as both of her parents had been gone. My grandfather had not wanted the cabin to be sold. My grandfather had been clear about this for as long as I had been old enough to understand him. The cabin had been the place he and my grandmother had built. The cabin had been the place that had held the only photographs of him and my grandmother that he had still been able to look at without breaking down. The cabin had been, in the small, specific way some places become irreplaceable to immigrant homeowners, the proof that the two of them had built something in this country that had lasted longer than their working years. In 2009, when I had been 19, my grandfather had asked me to come up to the cabin for a small, specific weekend. He had told me he had been wanting to talk to me about something. I had driven up. He had taken me out onto the small dock on the Saturday afternoon. He had been 77 at the time. He had said, in the careful voice he had been using when he had been telling me important things, "Nessa, I am going to do something. I am going to transfer half the cabin to you. I am going to do it in writing. I am going to file it at the county. I am not going to tell your mother or your father or your brother. I want you to keep it private for as long as I am alive. I want you to know that the cabin is half yours starting next month. I want you to know that when I die, the other half will go to your mother and your father through my will, but that the half I am giving you now will be yours independently, and they cannot do anything about it. I am doing this because I have been thinking about what your mother is going to do with this property after I am gone. I have been worrying about it for a long time. I want at least half of the cabin to be safe. Your half will be the safe half. I am sorry to be putting this on you at 19. I want you to know what is happening. I want you to be able to decide when the time comes what you want to do with what I am giving you." I had not known what to say. I had been 19. I had been a sophomore in college. I had been studying civil engineering, which had not yet involved the small, careful work with recorded property documents that my career would eventually involve. I had not had the framework at 19 to fully understand what my grandfather had been doing. I had simply nodded. I had told him I would honor what he had been asking me to honor. My grandfather had then driven me to a small attorney's office in the next town over on the Monday morning before I had driven back to college. The attorney had been a small, careful older woman named Miss Matilda Sjogren, who had been my grandfather's attorney for the previous 20 years. Miss Sjogren had prepared the quitclaim deed. My grandfather had signed it. The deed had transferred a 50% interest in the cabin and the 17 acres from Branko Polikoff to Nessa Polikoff as tenants in common. The deed had been recorded with the Carroll County Registry of Deeds in New Hampshire on a Wednesday in early April of 2009. The recording fee had been $46. My grandfather had paid it in cash. I had then gone back to college. I had not told anybody about the transfer. I had honored my grandfather's request. I want to tell you what I had been doing, quietly, for the 15 years between the transfer and his death. The first thing I had been doing was paying half of the property taxes on the cabin every year. My grandfather had not asked me to do this. I had decided on my own that since I had been a recorded co-owner, I should be carrying my proportional share of the carrying costs. The property tax bill on the cabin had been small. The annual tax had been roughly $2,800 in 2009. The tax had risen, over the 15 years, to approximately $3,800 by the year my grandfather had died. I had been paying half of each year's bill directly to the town tax collector. The payments had been made by personal check from my account. The town had recorded the payments under my name on the property tax records. The second thing I had been doing was maintaining a small private file of documentation related to the cabin. The file had included the recorded quitclaim deed. The file had included copies of my 15 years of tax payments. The file had included a small list of small improvements I had made to the cabin during my visits over the years. I had repaired the small dock in 2014. I had replaced the small wood stove in 2018. I had repainted the exterior of the cabin in 2021. The improvements had been documented with receipts. The third thing I had been doing was visiting the cabin regularly. I had been spending about 4 weekends per year at the cabin with my grandfather. We had been the only 2 people who had been spending real time there during those years. My parents had visited occasionally. My brother Merrick had visited maybe twice across the entire 15 years. The cabin had been, in practice if not in title, to most of my family, a small place that I had been co-stewarding with my grandfather. The co-stewardship had been visible to anybody who had been paying attention. Nobody had been paying attention. My grandfather had died on a Wednesday morning in late August. He had been 91 years old. He had died in his small bedroom at the cabin in his sleep. I had been the one who had found him. I had driven up that weekend because he had been complaining of small chest pains on the phone 3 days earlier, and I had wanted to check on him. He had been gone by the time I had arrived. The coroner had estimated he had been dead for about 6 hours. He had been peaceful. I had called my mother. My mother had been calm on the phone in the way she was calm when she was processing information she had been quietly expecting for a while. She had driven up with my father that afternoon. The 3 of us had handled the small initial arrangements. My brother Merrick had come up on Friday. We had held a small memorial at the cabin on Saturday for the small group of my grandfather's friends from the mill town who had still been alive. The memorial had been quiet. My grandfather had not wanted a formal funeral. After the memorial, my parents had asked me to stay at the cabin for the weekend before the will reading the following Tuesday morning. They had said the 4 of us should be together. I had agreed. I want to tell you what my mother had said to me on the Friday night. She had been in the kitchen of the cabin earlier in the evening. She had been sorting through some of my grandfather's small papers. My father had been on the small couch in the living room reading a book. My brother Merrick had been out at a small bar in the next town over. I had been upstairs in the small bedroom I had been used since I had been 6 years old. I had heard my mother walk up the stairs. She had walked into the bedroom. She had closed the door behind her. She had said the sentence I have already told you. She had told me the will reading was tomorrow. She had told me I would not need to be there. She had told me the cabin should stay in the family, and that my brother had been the one who had been spending every summer there, which had been factually incorrect, and that I should leave for the night. I had not argued. I had not corrected the factually incorrect statement about my brother. I had not raised my voice. I had simply asked her whether my father had known she was telling me this. She had said yes. I had nodded. I had picked up my overnight bag. I had walked down the stairs. I had said goodbye to my father, who had been still on the couch with his book. He had looked up. He had not said anything. He had looked back down at the book. He had not been comfortable enough with what was happening to say anything to me. He had also not been brave enough to stop it. I had driven the 4 hours back to Hartford. I had been crying for most of the first hour. I had stopped crying around the Massachusetts border. I had been quiet for the rest of the drive. I had arrived at my apartment at almost 3 in the morning. I had slept poorly. I had been up at 6. I had spent Saturday morning at my small kitchen table with my husband, Edric. Edric had known about the quitclaim deed since I had been 24. I had told him about it about a year after we had started dating. He had been the only person besides me, my grandfather, and Miss Sjogren who had known about it. He had been quiet for most of the morning. He had finally asked Miss what I had been planning to do. I had told him I had been thinking. I had told him I had been considering several options. I had told him I had not been planning to be theatrical about it. I had told him I had been planning to let the will reading happen on Tuesday morning, and then to wait for my mother to call me about it during the following week, and then to handle the conversation about the actual ownership structure at whatever moment had felt right. Edric had nodded. He had told me he would support whatever I decided. The will reading had happened on Tuesday morning. I had not been there. My grandfather's attorney, Miss Sjogren, had been at the reading. My parents had been there. My brother had been there. The will had been simple. The will had transferred my grandfather's interest in the cabin to my mother in full. The will had transferred a small savings account which had contained approximately $41,000 in equal shares to my brother and me. The will had transferred a small collection of personal items, including my grandfather's old machinist tools, to my brother. The will had transferred my grandmother's small jewelry collection, which had been in a small box my grandfather had been keeping at the cabin, to me. The will had named my mother as the executor. What the will had not addressed was the fact that the interest my grandfather had been transferring to my mother had been the 50% interest he had actually owned, not the 100% interest my mother, and the rest of the family had been assuming he owned. Miss Sjogren had not mentioned the quitclaim deed during the reading. Miss Sjogren had not been asked about it. My mother had not asked Miss Sjogren whether the deed records were complete. My mother had assumed they had been. My mother had been operating, as a matter of standard family expectation, on the assumption that my grandfather had owned the cabin in full at the time of his death. I had been told about the reading by Miss Sjogren over the phone on Tuesday afternoon. I had thanked her. I had told her I would be in touch in the coming weeks. She had told me she had been ready to assist whenever I had been ready. She had told me, in the small, careful voice she had been using on me for 15 years, that my grandfather had been very proud of the patience I had been showing in the years since the deed had been recorded, and that she had been hoping I would handle the situation in a way that would honor him. I had thanked her again. We had hung up. My mother had called me on Friday afternoon, 3 days after the reading. She had been pleasant on the phone. She had asked me how I had been. She had told me she had been wanting to talk to me about a few things. She had asked whether I could come over for dinner that Sunday at her house. I had told her I would come for coffee on Sunday afternoon instead of dinner. I had driven up to my parents' house on the Sunday afternoon. I had brought a small folder. The folder had been in the small leather portfolio I had been carrying. The folder had contained a copy of the 2009 quitclaim deed, a copy of the recorded acknowledgement from the Carroll County Registry of Deeds, 15 years of property tax payment records, and a small one-page summary I had prepared for the conversation. My parents had been waiting at the kitchen table. My mother had made coffee. My father had been sitting in his usual chair. The three of us had sat down. My mother had started the conversation. She had said, in the small, careful voice she had been using throughout the previous week, "Nessa, we want to talk about the cabin. Your father and I have been thinking. We do not want the cabin sitting unused. Merrick has agreed to take it over. He and his wife are going to use it for their family. We want you to know that we have not forgotten about you. We have decided to give you $20,000 from the savings account as a small additional acknowledgement of your relationship with your grandfather. We think this is fair. We want you to be happy for Merrick. We want the family to move forward." I had been quiet for a moment. I had then opened the leather portfolio. I had pulled out the folder. I had set it on the kitchen table. I had said, in the small, clear voice I had been preparing for several days, "Mom, Dad, before we go any further with the discussion of what you have been deciding about the cabin, I want to share something with you. I want to share it because the decision about the cabin is not entirely yours to make. I have been a co-owner of the cabin since 2009. Grandpa transferred 50% of the property to me through a recorded quitclaim deed when I was 19. The deed has been on file at the county registry for 15 years. I have been paying half of the property taxes for the entire 15 years. I have a complete file of the documentation. Grandpa did not tell you about the transfer because he had been worried about what you would do with the cabin after he was gone. He asked me to keep it private during his lifetime. I honored his request. The request is no longer in effect. I am telling you now. I had pushed the folder across the kitchen table. My mother had not moved. My father had reached forward and had picked up the folder. He had opened it. He had looked at the first page, which had been the cover page summary I had prepared. He had read through it slowly. He had then handed it to my mother. My mother had taken it. She had read it. She had read it a second time. She had looked up at me. She had said, in the smallest voice I had ever heard her use, "Nessa, this cannot be right." I had told her it was right. I had told her she could verify the recording at the county registry. I had told her the documentation in the folder was complete. I had told her I had also been in contact with Ms. Sjogren, who had been my grandfather's attorney and had also been the attorney who had prepared the deed in 2009 and who had been familiar with the entire arrangement. My mother had been quiet for almost a full minute. My father had also been quiet. He had been looking at the table. My mother had finally said, "Why did your grandfather not tell us?" I had told her the truth. I had told her my grandfather had been worried that she would try to find a way to undo the transfer if she had known about it during his lifetime. I had told her my grandfather had been particularly worried because he had been observing for years the way she had been treating me at family events. I had told her my grandfather had said to me, on several occasions during my late 20s, that he had been increasingly concerned that I had been being positioned as the unfavored child, and that he had wanted to make sure I had a small material protection independent of whatever decisions she and my father would eventually make about his estate. My mother had not been able to respond. My father had been crying quietly. I had not seen my father cry in 25 years. I had then told them what I had been preparing to offer. I had told them I had not been planning to force a sale of the cabin. I had told them I knew the cabin had been important to my mother and to my father in their own way, even though their way had been different from my way and from my grandfather's way. I had told them I had been considering several of his options. The first option I had told them would be for me to buy out my mother's 50% interest. I would pay her the fair market value of her half, which I had estimated at approximately $310,000 based on recent sales of similar properties in the area. I would pay her in cash within 30 days. I would then own the cabin in full. I would be free to use it or not use it as I chose. The second option would be for my mother to buy out my 50% interest. She would pay me the same fair market value in cash within 30 days. She would then own the cabin in full. She would be free to give it to my brother, sell it, or do whatever else she chose. The third option, which I had been thinking about most carefully, would be for me to keep my half and for my mother to keep hers, with a small formal written agreement about the use of the cabin going forward that would acknowledge my ownership rights and that would allow me and my husband and our future children to use the cabin during specified weeks each year. The agreement would also acknowledge my brother's right to use the cabin during other specified weeks. The agreement would prohibit any sale of the cabin without the consent of both co-owners. The agreement would establish a shared maintenance fund. I had told my parents I had a preference for the third option, but that I was open to either of the first two options if my parents had preferred. I had told them I would give them 30 days to decide. I had told them I had been working with Miss Sjogren to prepare the formal documentation for whichever option they selected. My mother had been processing what I had said. She had been struggling to process. The information had been more than she had been ready to handle. She had finally said, in the small breaking voice she had not been able to keep out of her voice for the entire conversation, "Nessa, why did you not say anything when I asked you to leave the cabin on Friday night?" I had told her the truth. I had told her I had been waiting for 15 years to find out what kind of person my mother would actually turn out to be once my grandfather had died. I had told her the Friday night had been the answer to that question. I had told her the answer had been clarifying. I had told her the clarity had been useful. I had told her the clarity had allowed me to come to this conversation today, knowing exactly what I had been working with. I had told her I had been sorry the clarity had been as clear as it had been. I had told her I had been hoping, for 15 years, that she would turn out to be a different kind of mother. I had told her she had not. I had stood up. I had walked out of the kitchen. I had driven home. I want to tell you what has happened in the 6 months since. My mother had taken the full 30 days to decide. She had not been able to come to a decision on her own. She had called me on day 28. She had told me she had been wanting the third option. She had asked whether the third option had still been on the table. I had told her yes. The third option had still been on the table. We had executed the formal co-ownership agreement 6 weeks later. The agreement had been drafted by Miss Sjogren. The agreement had been signed by me and by my mother in Miss Sjogren's small office on a Wednesday afternoon. My father had been there. My brother had not been there. My brother had refused to participate in the conversation. My brother had not been speaking to me since the day my mother had told him about the deed, which she had told him about on the day after our coffee conversation. My brother had been the most upset of anybody in the family. My brother had been understanding, in the small, slow way he had been understanding it, that his expected inheritance of the entire cabin had not actually been an expected inheritance at all. My brother had been struggling with the understanding. I had not been helping him struggle. I had been letting him figure it out at his own pace. My husband Edric and I have been at the cabin for 2 weekends since the agreement was signed. We have brought our small dog. We have been the only people there both times. The cabin has been the place I had been visiting for almost 30 years. The cabin has been mine now. In a way, it had been mine since I had been 19, but in a different way now that the family had finally been told about it. The cabin has been a different place to be in since the conversation. The cabin has been quieter. The cabin has been mine in the way my grandfather had been wanting it to be. My mother has been distant. The distance has not been hostile. The distance has been the small, careful distance of a woman who has been processing what she had been doing to me for 15 years, and what my grandfather had been doing in response, and who has not yet figured out how to be in a relationship with me on the other side of what she now knows. I have been letting her process. I have not been pushing her. The pushing would have been counterproductive. The processing is hers to do. My father has been calling me more. My father has been the parent who has been more receptive to the change in the family structure. My father has been telling me, in his small, careful way, that he had not known how to push back on my mother during the years she had been positioning me as the unfavored daughter. He had been telling me he was sorry. He had been telling me he had been proud of my grandfather for what my grandfather had done. He had been telling me he was proud of me for handling it the way I had handled it. We have been having short phone calls about once a week. The calls have been awkward. The calls have been, however, more honest than any calls I have had with my father in the past 2 decades. I want to tell you what I have learned, because the learning has been the foundation of everything I have been thinking about for the past 6 months. The first thing I have learned is that the most important thing a grandparent can do for an unfavored grandchild is to act quickly and quietly while they are still alive, in a way that creates a structural protection that does not depend on the goodwill of the favored family members after the grandparent is gone. My grandfather had done this for me when I had been 19. He had not needed to. He could have written me into a more elaborate will, or set up a small trust, or done any number of other things that would have been more visible, and that would have been easier to challenge after his death. He had instead done the smallest, quietest, hardest to undo thing, which had been a recorded quitclaim deed at the county registry. The deed had been a piece of public record from the moment it had been filed. The deed had been impossible for my mother to challenge 15 years later, because the deed had been duly recorded, signed by a competent grandfather who had been 77 at the time and who had been clearly of sound mind, and reflected through 15 years of subsequent tax payments by me. The deed had been the smallest possible legal action that had created the largest possible protection. The smallness had been the wisdom. The smallness had been the gift. If you have a grandparent who has been considering what to do for you in their estate planning, please consider that the smallest, quietest, most recorded action available to them may be more valuable than the largest, most elaborate will. The will is the thing the family fights over. The recorded deed is the thing the family cannot fight over. The smallness is the protection. Please ask the grandparent, gently and at the right moment, if there is something small they could do for you while they are still alive. The second thing I have learned is that the family members who have been positioning you as the unfavored child for years are sometimes operating on assumptions about the family's underlying structure that may be wrong. My mother had been operating for 15 years on the assumption that she would eventually inherit the cabin in full. My mother had been positioning me as the unfavored daughter, in part because she had been quietly believing that I would not be in a position to push back against the family's decisions about the cabin after my grandfather was gone. My mother had been wrong about the underlying structure. The wrongness had been quiet. The wrongness had been documented in a recorded deed at a county registry that my mother had never thought to check. If you have a family member who has been positioning you as the unfavored one for years, please consider that they may be operating on assumptions about the family structure that are not entirely accurate. The assumptions may include things you do not know about, that the favored family members may not know about, that older generations may have quietly set up to protect you. The protections may be invisible until you go looking for them. The looking is sometimes worth doing. Ask your grandparents, your great-aunts, your older family friends, the small attorneys who may have been in the family's orbit for years. Ask them if there is anything they know about that you may not know about. The asking is sometimes the small specific thing that uncovers a protection that has been waiting for you. You may already be protected. You may not yet know it. Find out. The third thing I have learned, and the last one I want to give to you, is that the moment your mother kicks you out of the family cabin the night before the will reading is not always the moment of greatest loss in the story. The moment is sometimes the moment of greatest clarity. My mother had revealed, in the small 20-second conversation in the upstairs bedroom on the Friday night, exactly who she had been for the previous 34 years. The revealing had been clean. The revealing had been undeniable. The revealing had been the small specific piece of information I had been needing for 15 years to finalize my own understanding of who my mother was and what I was going to do with the knowledge. The revealing had not been a loss. The revealing had been a gift. The gift had been the elimination of any remaining uncertainty about whether my mother was capable of being a different kind of mother than the kind she had been. The elimination of the uncertainty had been the thing that had let me, the following Sunday afternoon, walk into her kitchen with the folder and to handle the conversation without any lingering hope that I had been somehow misreading the situation. The hope had been gone. The hope had been replaced with clarity. The clarity had been more useful than the hope had ever been. If somebody in your family does something to you that feels like a final unkindness, please consider that the final unkindness may also be the small clarifying gift you have been needing in order to handle the rest of the relationship from a position of accurate information. The accurate information is more valuable than the hope had been. The hope had been keeping you stuck. The accurate information is what frees you. The freedom is the small, dark gift that the worst moments in our families sometimes give us. The freedom is what allows us, finally, to act on what we have been knowing for years without being able to act on it. Receive the freedom. The freedom is what you have been waiting for. The waiting is over. The acting is now yours to do. I want to ask you something before you go. Tell me, in the comments, about the moment a family member finally did something that confirmed, beyond any remaining doubt, who they actually were. Tell me what they did. Tell me what you had been holding out hope they would not do. Tell me what you did when the doubt was finally gone. There are more of us than the families who confirmed themselves to us would ever guess. We have been receiving the small dark gifts, slowly, for years. The gifts have been the foundation of every honest action we have taken since. Tell me yours. I will be reading every single comment. I will see you in the next one.